بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السادة الحضور، نرحب بكم في ندوة جديدة من الندوات العلمية التي تنظمها أكاديمية نسيج عبر الإنترنت، والتي كما يعلم المتابعون لهذه السلسلة من الندوات أنها تستهدف طرح الرؤى والقضايا والمستجدات من التقنيات في مجالات التعليم والتعلم وإدارة المعرفة وغيرها من الموضوعات التي تهم المتخصص والباحث والأكاديمي في تلك المجالات في عالمنا العربي. وتنبع خصوصية ندوتنا اليوم من جانبين: الأول أنها تتناول موضوعا محط اهتمام الكثيرين، وهو الأرشيفات الرقمية والممارسات المرتبطة بها، وما قد تنطوي عليه من هنات تحتاج إلى استراتيجيات وفنيات لتجنبها. لذا استضفنا للحديث عن هذا الموضوع خبير عالمي هو البروفيسور كريستوفر بروم، القائم بمهام نائب رئيس جامعة إلينوي للبحث والابتكار والفنون والعلوم الإنسانية والمجالات ذات الصلة، والعميد المساعد للاستراتيجيات الرقمية والشؤون الأكاديمية بمكتبة جامعة إلينوي، الجامعة الأولى في برامج المكتبات في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية حاليا، وزميل جمعية الأرشيفيين الأمريكيين. والجانب الآخر الذي تنبع منه خصوصية هذه الندوة هو أنها تمثل باكورة أنشطة التعاون والشراكة الاستراتيجية بموجب مذكرة التعاون التي تم توقيعها في 9 من هذا الشهر بين أكاديمية نسيج وجامعة حفر الباطن، ممثلة في عمادة شؤون المكتبات، والتي يشرفنا بالحضور معنا هنا سعادة الدكتور فهد الجمعي، عميد شؤون المكتبات بجامعة حفر الباطن، والذي أدعوه لإلقاء كلمة الافتتاح لهذه الندوة. تفضل دكتور فهد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. نرحب حقيقة وبداية بسعادة البروف الدكتور كريستوفر بروم في هذه الندوة العلمية المعنونة بالأرشيف الرقمي. ونحن بدورنا حقيقة نشكر أكاديمية نسيج ممثلة في البروف الدكتور عبد الله متولي، وايضا القائمين على شركه النسيج المهندس عبد الله الطريفي، وكل القائمين فيها على ان اتاحوا لنا الفرصه لعقد شراكه تعاون بيننا وبينهم في مجال اداره المعلومات والمكتبات، وايضا في المجال البحثي. ونرحب بالجميع ونتمنى ان تكون ندوه علميه جيده يستفيد منها الحضور، ونستفيد نحن كذلك من هذه الندوة. وشكرا للجميع.
شكرا سعادة الدكتور فهد الجمعي على كلماتكم الافتتاحية والمتميزة، والتي أكدت فيها على الحرص المتبادل على التعاون بين أكاديمية نسيج وجامعة حفر الباطن. وانتقل الآن إلى متحدثنا البروفيسور كريستوفر بروم، منوها إلى أن الأسئلة والاستفسارات سيتم تلقيها كتابة سواء باللغة الإنجليزية أو العربية، وهنا أنوه إلى أن هناك قناة باللغة العربية مترجمة فوريا لهذه الندوة التي تقدم باللغة الإنجليزية. وهذه الأسئلة سوف يتم تلقيها في صندوق question and answer أو الأسئلة والاستفسارات لإتاحة الفرصة لأكبر عدد ممكن من الحضور لطرح أسئلة. كما أنوه على أهمية أن يكون هناك حرص على المشاركة في بعض الاستفسارات التي ستطرح من جانب المتحدث بالتصويت عليها. Professor Christopher, as you heard me in the English channel, we are welcoming you and express our honor to have you as a speaker in this webinar. I will not take more time from your presentation, so the virtual floor is yours. Please, Dr. Chris.
Good evening, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. I'd like to thank Dr. Abdallah and Dean Fahad also for welcoming me and for those introductory remarks. I am so very happy to be here with you this evening, actually morning in my time here in Champaign-Urbana in the Midwestern part of the United States. International collaborations are always so valuable to me, and as this is the first international collaboration I've had with people in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia and in the Mideast, I particularly appreciate this opportunity. As Dr. Abdallah said, my name is Christopher Prom, but I actually go by Chris for short. I am an Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And as I said, I'm very, very pleased to be speaking with you this evening. So I'd like to start with a little bit of background about the University of Illinois so you know where I'm located and what perspective I'm coming from. The University of Illinois is a large public comprehensive university. We enroll about 50,000 students, and we are also what is known here in the United States as a land grant university. We're part of a group of public universities that were founded in 1867 after the United States Civil War with a grant of land from the federal government to the university and to the state to help educate people in practical, mechanical, and agricultural arts. So we've grown considerably since that time in our mission. And at this point, we are comprehensive. We have a very strong program in almost all aspects of public education here in the United States, and in particular in information sciences. We also are pleased to host students from around the world, and I checked the enrollment statistics before speaking with you here, and I noted that our campus currently enrolls 69 students from Saudi Arabia, 43 from Egypt, 86 from Iran, 5 from the United Arab Emirates, 4 from Kuwait, and 1 single student from Oman. So we're very pleased to have those students and those collaborations and the expertise and ideas they're bringing to us, because the university is very much a hub for scientific and engineering research in particular. In fact, our university is the recipient of the highest level of funding in the United States from the National Science Foundation. Also importantly for Nasej Academy, and we are home to the #1 ranked library and information science school in the United States. The library, in fact, where I work here at the university, is the second largest public research library in the country in the United States. And we hold over 15 million physical volumes, as well as a leadership position with digital collections, which is part of my area of expertise. So as you can see from this map, we are located in the Midwestern part of the United States. I mentioned this because I bring what might be called a Midwest practical sensibility or sense to digital archives. And I'll turn to that topic in a minute. As a little bit of background, that Midwest orientation means that throughout my work, I try to bring a practical approach, focusing on techniques for digital preservation that are easy to implement in all kinds of institutions, from small to big, from government archives to private collections. These are practices that meet with what 2 of my colleagues call the more product, less process approach. That is to say, using efficient, low-cost methods to preserve digital records, specifically by adapting some of the same processes we've used for physical collections and print archives to those same sorts of digital files that are now the primary means of communication and documentation that we have for modern society. I also mentioned this practical sensibility because one of the outcomes from my work in the past was another international exchange when I was a fellow at the Center for Archive and Information Studies at the University of Dundee. This is a place where I spent some time collaborating with my European colleagues and is documented at this blog, which I will show you a little bit more about in a minute. So I'm very happy to be here today, as I said, and to broaden my consultations, because I always learn a lot from international colleagues, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions, your thoughts, and your perspectives as well, because I very much value those. I'd also like to just briefly mention that the University of Illinois has a series of connections with library and information colleagues throughout the world, specifically through our Mortensen Center for International Library Programs. This summer, they are sponsoring an associate's program, which is allowing people to visit our campus and other libraries in the Midwest so that they can learn more about trends that are taking place in United States library and information science. So in a few weeks, 11 individuals from the Mideast, from Asia, from South America will be visiting us here in Champaign-Urbana. And we're very excited about that because the pandemic now allows for international travelers to come again to the United States. And in fact, we will be having two visitors from, one from Oman and one from Kuwait, who are being sponsored by Naseej Academy, for which we are very grateful. And I will be a library buddy, that is to say a friendly face for one of the other participants in this program who will be visiting us from a university in Pakistan. So before we begin the heart of this session, which is about 10 digital archives bad practices or mistakes and how to avoid them, I'd like to just share a little bit of my own background because it may help you understand a little bit more about my perspective. So I was trained as a historian. I was not formally trained in library and information science, but as part of my work as a historian, I learned the importance of tracking down evidence as I traveled through the north of England looking for sources for my dissertation. And this rather unexpectedly led me to a career as an archivist. As I was working on my dissertation, I discovered that I loved working with archives, with those print documents, those letters, those photographs, and those traces of human activity that people leave behind. But I also learned as part of that archives are only useful if we preserve as much context as possible about where those records came from and about the people who created them. So for 20 years after my trip to England to do my dissertation, I worked here as an archivist at the university. And along the way, I became very, very interested in digital technology. So I was fortunate enough with some of my colleagues to help develop digital access systems for archives. And I'll mention some of those later. I've also had the opportunity to edit some books on best practices relating to digital archives. And during that time, one of my colleagues here, Bethany Anderson, who I believe spoke to you, to Naseej Academy webinar participants several weeks ago, also worked closely with her and as an intern on a board that I directed. I've also provided in this slide a link to my sabbatical project, just in case you'd like to look at that for more information. I would note that many of the things that are cited there are several years out of date at this point. So that's enough about me. In order to get us started here, I'd like to ask briefly if I can get a better understanding of who all of you are and where you're coming from. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do here is start a Zoom poll. So if you give me just a second, I will start a question for you here. And I will ask if that could be translated into Arabic. So here is the poll. Yes, very good. I see you're answering it. I'm glad it's working. Great. Well, thank you. I see 70 people have answered so far, so I appreciate your participation. We'll give a little bit of additional time here for people to respond. Well, very good. Thank you. Thank you for those responses. I'm very much in agreement with all of you because I like to avoid mistakes. I don't like to make them myself. I see other people making them, and I also see them as a learning opportunity. So if I were to answer this question myself, I would have checked the fourth box, all of the above. And that's our first question in the poll here. I also have a second question for you, which is, where do all of you work? What types of organizations do you work for? Are you a student? Do you work for a corporation or business? Do you work for a university? Do you work in a government organization or for a nonprofit or religious archives? So I have a second question for you, if you could please take some time to complete that. Thank you for that answer. It only showed the results, so I should stop sharing. And maybe it's working now. Ah, there we go. Yes, thank you. Very good. Well, thank you all so very much. I see we have a range of people attending this evening, and I very much appreciate that. Many of you are in universities and in government organizations, a smaller number in nonprofits or business settings, and an additional number of students. So I just want to say before we launch into the main part of the evening tonight that I hope to have some interesting and valuable information for all of you today. Okay, so what I would like to do before we go further is say that there are really two main points to this workshop that I'll be stressing throughout. And the first is that digital archives are very complex, but we can use some simple techniques to manage them. And secondly, that we all learn more through our mistakes than we do through our successes. In fact, in my case, each mistake that I've made with digital archives has helped me build knowledge and skills that have led me toward better practice. So I hope at the end of this webinar that you've learned a few best practices for selecting, for arranging, for describing, preserving, and providing access to born digital materials, such as digital documents, such as emails, such as digital photographs, websites, and social media records. I also hope that you are able to take those learnings and knowledge and help use them in your institution to build a program to preserve those materials. And finally, I hope you learn and take away that programs for born digital materials are critical elements of the way that we all can document our organizations or institutions. And not only those organizations and institutions, but the individuals and people who are engaged in it and who are shaping society and culture. So here's a brief agenda of what we'll review. First, I will describe what I mean by digital archives. It's a very easy phrase to say, but I think it means something a little bit different to everyone. So after asking all of you what you think, I will offer my own perspective and definition so that you know what types of problems I'm referring to. Second, I will be telling you about 10 specific mistakes or bad practices that I have personally made over the years. And yes, I know speakers are supposed to be experts and authorities on topics, but I'll share reflections on what I've done wrong and how I've learned from that and how you hopefully can take some lessons away from my mistakes as well. And then third, I'm going to link each of those mistakes or bad practices to a corresponding good practice, a lesson that I took away from each of those cases and that I think hopefully you can take away as well. And then along the path, I'll be referencing some current tools, techniques, and readings that hopefully you'll find those resources helpful if you need or want to establish a digital archives program. So here's a question for all of you. When I say the phrase digital archives, what comes into your mind? what types of materials do you think I might be referring to? So I'd like to provide you a few minutes or a few moments just to place a phrase or some text in the chat box in Zoom. So if you could put some responses in chat, I would very much appreciate that in either English or Arabic. A document, yes, very good. Photographs, music, graphics, photos, records, physical archives that have been digitized, files. These are all excellent responses. CDs, many of us still have these silver discs, these CDs available. Computer files, emails, GED, pictures, tons of documents, pretty much any sort of documents. That's a really good response. Sound files, folder structures. What about books? That's a good question.
Yeah. If I just introducing the Arabic, they will have here the lectures, we have here the government publication. There is some French that's confirming this one.
Presence, yes.
Yeah.
All the documents of my
digital
university.
clouding content.
Booked. Yes, very good responses. I'm really thinking of all of these types of things. And as one person put into chat, can we consider all of these in archives? And I very much would do that. So I'd like to thank you all for those comments and thoughts here. What I'm going to say before we go a little bit further is that when I think of these words, digital archives, I always keep in mind that the word digital is an adjective that is modifying the noun archives. And archives, like one person said, could cover almost any type of documentary format. It could be a book, it could be a photograph, it could be a CD. The primary distinguishing factor of it is that it's in digital form. Before we go any further, I just want to mention that like many university archivists in the United States, I work within something called the public archives tradition, which is often associated with buildings like the National Archives, which you show here in a photograph. And these are organizations that have responsibility for documenting these many types of formats. If you're interested in learning more about the public archives tradition, I'd highly recommend these two books. The first is by James O'Toole and Richard Cox called Understanding Archives and Manuscripts. And the second is a book by John Reddener. I would just like to emphasize a couple of factors that these books talk about without going into a lot of detail. The public archives tradition that I work within tends to emphasize a few things which are best summarized in this definition of archives from the Society of American Archivists. You can see here this document specifies that archives are non-current records and that they document the forms, the function, and the activities of institutions. So there's an emphasis on archives as records. And within that tradition, records are seen as methods of ensuring accountability, helping guarantee citizens their rights, and helping develop an informed population. And secondly, the archives tradition emphasizes that archives should always be maintained with respect for their original order and for their provenance. In other words, we should respect who created the records and store records in an order that reflects the way that they were created. So when thinking about digital records, I tend to take my cue from the work of David Bierman. David Bierman defined records essentially as transmitted information. This is something that sounds very simple, but in thinking about the interactions between a message that is sent, the sender of that message, and the recipient, you can see that preserving information itself is good, but it's not sufficient. We also need to preserve information about when and how records were created or shared. In other words, that chain of events that led to it being sent from one person or organization to another person or organization. So as an archivist, I always think about trying to preserve this chain of custody or preservation. At the end of the day, all records or all of these document types that you mentioned are forms of transmitted information, which of course leads us to the concept of metadata as an integral part of the record. So we don't just have an information object, we also have information about that object. There is both a thing or an information object or set of objects we're trying to preserve, and the set of actions taken on or about that record from the time it was created through its life cycle and ultimately its management in an archives. So expanding a little bit on this, my primary topic today is how archives can avoid making mistakes when dealing with born digital records. So by born digital records, I essentially am talking here about records that document human activity and records that exist first in digital form. So I'm not really addressing scanned records. I noticed one individual mentioned scanned documents or documents that have been migrated from some non-digital format. That's also a very important topic, but it's one that I'm leaving for another day to focus really on these records that start their life in digital form. So on this slide, I have placed a set of challenges for born digital records and things that can be difficult issues that people want to examine or need to examine, in fact, when looking at these digital files. For example, there are a wide variety of formats, as all of you mentioned, making these records potentially difficult to render or view. The context about those records can become easily lost. People manage them in very different ways. So if you look at my email account and Dr. Abdallah's email account, you'd see two very different information management practices. There also seem to be complex standards about them. So all of these topics seem very challenging, but they're also very surmountable. They are also something we can jump over or jump through or deal with a few best practices. So in order to get to those best practices, I'd like to tell you first about some bad practices, because once you know a bad practice, you can learn about the corresponding good practice that relates to it. And I'm going to be honest with you here. Each of these bad practices are things that I myself have done over the years. So here's the first mistake or bad practice. It's what I call putting things in a folder or putting things in a box. And here's what I'm talking about. A few years before my sabbatical in 2009, my archives had been acquiring all kinds of digital content. And we had this vague idea in our heads that we should be doing something very important with all of it, and that somehow at some future point in time, we would decide how to deal with these materials. So we took all of this and we put it in a folder. We set a folder up on a shared file system. We called it electronic records, and we began putting things in there. We'd set up a subfolder, and we eventually had all dozens of different subfolders, each one with a different naming practice. And we had no way of knowing who had put the content there or what it was, because we hadn't kept a separate track record of what those materials were. So here was the problem behind the problem. And we had become part of what my colleague Ben Goldman at the University of Pennsylvania had described in this quotation, which I provided for you. Essentially, we were acquiring materials without any formal plan for their ongoing management or preservation. We thought we were doing the right thing, and we had started because we were gathering the records, but we really didn't have a clue or a plan as to what we were doing. So as Ben Goldman lays out in the rest of his article, there is a very better way forward, And that begins by developing what I call a preservation ethos or a preservation ethic. That doesn't mean that you need to have a long list of policy documents, but it does mean a few simple things which I've listed here. You should have a charge or a mission or an understanding of what types of records you want to acquire. You should decide in a collection focus which are most important to you. You should have some guiding values or commitments. And then you can begin acquiring materials with plans and specific strategies to accomplish the basic work of an archivist, which is to acquire, as I've said, to acquire, to preserve, describe, store, and arrange and provide access to materials. So we'll talk more about each of those topics in the rest of the talk here, but that's my first bad practice, put it in a folder, and the better practice, which is develop a preservation ethos. This leads to my second mistake, which was, as I say here, going it alone or trying to figure everything out on my own. And I say this somewhat ironically because I had the luxury of spending 10 months on a sabbatical reading all about digital preservation literature. But back in 2009, I had this somewhat naive idea that if I just sat down and read all of this literature, I could figure everything out on myself and come up with a good preservation plan for our archives. And that was a mistake. So I spent a large portion of the time when I was on sabbatical at the University of Dundee, poring over, looking at graphics like this one. Some of you may have seen this before. It's something called the Reference Model for an Open Archival Information System, or OAIS for short. And it looks very complicated, doesn't it? It is very complicated.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
It is because it defines the entire set of human and technical systems that in theory are needed in order to preserve digital information. You can get a sense for how complicated this is if you remember that this wasn't designed by archivists. It was actually designed by space scientists, people who design rockets and satellites and explore astronomical data. And it was originally developed to describe how to preserve astronomical and other kinds of space science data. So I spent a lot of time looking at documents like this, and I learned a lot in doing that. But at the end, what I learned is that it's more important to foster and support partnerships with other individuals, such as the type of partnership we have here with Naseej Academy and that you're all part of. So I discovered that I didn't need to figure this entire graphic out on my own. What I really needed to do was understand a few core elements of it, match those to my past experiences, and here's the important point, develop those partnerships, those collaborations with other people, both inside my institution and in the international community, because those people would help me identify those systems, processes, and tools that could help our archives preserve born digital information. So this might seem like a very simple or even trite sort of insight, but it was very important for me. And at the time, I summarized it in a blog post that I put on my blog, which shows a view here out of our window in the village we were living in Scotland. But really what I discovered was that I didn't need to figure this whole thing out on my own and that we could go forward from that point. I'd just like to mention here as a little bit of an aside, and if I might, personal word of encouragement for future collaborations, that the University of Illinois will be hosting a digital preservation conference in September of 2023. And that will be here in Champaign-Urbana. And we would very much welcome any or all of you to attend that meeting. This is the iPres meeting. This September, it will be in Glasgow, Scotland, and in September of 2023, it will be here in the United States, at which we will share all kinds of expertise and we will share the insights of many, many partners from around the world on digital preservation practices. Okay, so that's my second mistake, going it alone, and my better practice, which is encouraging international collaboration. So if I can just say briefly then, my third bad practice is jumping in too quickly. So if going it alone is one mistake, that might seem easy to avoid, but another mistake is starting too quickly. And I don't know if you have this idiom in Arabic, but in English.
Slowly but surely.
Do you? Yeah.
Slowly but surely.
I would imagine you do. This is a belly flop, right? Where you think you're going to fly, but in reality, you end up falling into the mud and making a big mess, not only of yourself, but everybody else. And if you jump in too quickly, this is unfortunately what can end up happening. So this is something I learned firsthand with one of our own collections here after I returned from my sabbatical. I've included a photograph here. This is a faculty office on our campus back in the year 2010. This shows the office of a very important chemical sciences professor on campus. The photo itself is a little bit dark, but you can see there are a variety of papers laying around and several discarded computers. We knew that this material had a lot of value because the professor had invented some early computer-based programs for teaching chemistry. But we had a lot of questions about how to go sorting through this massive collection. And we thought that by simply copying all of the files and looking through them, that would be the best way to get started. But thankfully remembered that we didn't have a formal program in place. So we started instead by developing a collection management statement, developing a plan, and then putting that plan into effect. So instead of jumping right in like we're doing in this slide, we decided instead to develop some short-term goals and objectives. So at this point, we didn't yet have a full collection management statement. We didn't have a long set of processing documentation or guidelines or commitments, but we did develop a few short-term goals, which was essentially to secure transfer of these materials and to develop what I'm calling some accession information. We took our guidance here from the digital records lifecycle concept, which Dr. Abdallah and others, you may have discovered or read about this concept other places, the digital records lifecycle, which talks about records as they go through the phase of collective or active management and use through appraisal and selection and acquisition. We knew that we didn't have all of these things developed. For example, we didn't have a processing strategy. We didn't have a preservation strategy, but we could develop appraisal and selection criteria at this point. So that's what we did. We were at the acquisition stage of the digital records life cycle. And this is when, as archivists, we assume stewardship and legal responsibility for the records. So at this point, what we needed to do was develop a secure transfer mechanism. In this case, that meant using disk imaging software to get an exact copy of what was on those computers. It also meant, for example, that collection should get a fixity check. This notion of fixity helps ensure integrity by generating a digital checksum for each file at the time we required it. And then the third piece the third step that we developed at this stage was developing an acquisition log. That at the time we were acquiring the material, it also made some very good sense to record some basic information about its history, about the context and content of the acquisition at the time the materials were being acquired. So remember earlier I had said we were putting everything in a folder. We were still putting things in a folder, but we were also recording some information about those materials at the time we acquired them. And this was very important because if we didn't process those materials right away, if we didn't add them to the right library catalog, we then had some information about them so we could make decisions at a future time. So that's our third mistake and our better practice, which is to develop short-term goals and objectives. Okay, so on to our fourth mistake, and this again, this is a one that
If you
you'll
allow
want to
me-
avoid. Yes, sure,
Sorry,
Dr.
Chris, for
Abdallah.
interruption. Yes, I'm just, before just moving to the fourth mistake, I just need to give an announcement for our respectful attendees. If anyone has questions or inquiry, please, he can write it down because we're trying to give the maximum advantage of the time. So you can write it down whether now or after the presentation. So Professor Christopher will answer it. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris, please.
Very good. Okay, so this leads me to the fourth mistake you'll want to avoid, and that is setting up very strict, inflexible workflows or processes. So strict workflows may be very useful if you're dealing with only one type of file, for example, PDF documents, but in reality, as most of you were saying, most digital archives consist of a range of formats and content that cover multiple file types. So at this point, I'd like to come back to that spaghetti looking diagram that I presented earlier, which is the OIS reference model. And here's a much simpler version of it. So at its most basic level, this seems like a very linear workflow where records enter the system on the left side and they work through a submission information package through a set of actions to become an archival information package. And then they're presented to users on the right side. So while this seems very strict and inflexible, in reality, it can be implemented in a very flexible way. So if the problem is being too strict, the solution is to be flexible, but within reason. That is to have some guardrails, if you will, and to use the OIS reference model, but to do so in a flexible way. One of the important things about that reference model that I discovered late was that it does not mandate that everything be treated the same way. So the nature of the materials you are preserving as well as your own goals should allow you to adapt the part of this model that makes the most sense to you as a professional working in the field. And again, by working with others who have other areas of expertise, you will discover that there are a range of tools that again can help you arrange, describe, and provide access to born digital records. Now, what we, or one key moment for myself in my own learning was the adoption of this simplified step model for processing digital records. And by processing, I mean taking those records from being acquired and sitting in a folder to moving them into a preservation and access system with metadata so that people can discover them. So this step model divides digital processing into areas where arrangement and description information about these archives is gathered, collected, or used. And these 6 areas are conducting research about the person who created the materials or the organization, surveying the collection, looking it over, getting some basic information about it, creating a plan to arrange and describe it, then arranging the materials, describing the materials, and finally providing access to them. So these are actually 6 steps that we follow typically within this flexible model. As an example of the flexibility, let's take one sample format. For example, if you are working with email messages, and if your repository would like to preserve email messages, as I would argue that you should be, then you will need to consider a range of ways that you can acquire that type of record. And you'll want to make sure that the methods are consistent with those of other types of records. So here I've listed some ways that you might acquire email. You could ask people to directly export it from their email accounts. This is a preferred way, but it requires working directly with the donor or with an IT information technology staff. You could use an export function in applications like Microsoft Outlook or Gmail. which supports the export of entire accounts. Those will come to you in a format that will then require future migration, but that is a good option. Or you may discover that you have email methods or email messages that you find on a disk drive of somebody's laptop computer. Say a donor turns that laptop over to you and it has a piece of email software on it. There may be copies of the messages on that computer. In that case, you'd want to use a tool like disk imaging or simple copy of the messages and then migration. The point is you should allow for flexibility at all levels of your practice, and that while some overall direction and approach is helpful through your policies, it does need to allow for flexibility. So that leads me to bad practice number 5, which is to trust technology to solve all of your problems. I'm not saying this because you shouldn't trust technology, but to quote one of our former United States presidents, you should always trust but verify that technology is doing what you want, or you might end up with the digital archives equivalent of this comical error message from a website. I'll just let you know that I've had my own technology problems, an asteroid strike here or belly flop story that I can tell you. Very early in my career, one of the first things I did was, as an archivist, was delete all of our collections data from one of our major archives because I didn't understand how technology works. I didn't understand how linked tables work in databases. Now, thankfully, we got all of that data back because we had a systems administrator who was a lot smarter than I was and who had set up the program to back up the information on a nightly basis. But out of that error message and out of that error, I learned always to make sure you understand what the technology is doing once you open the hood of the car to look inside and see what is taking place.
It was a disaster, I guess.
It was a disaster, but it was one that we recovered from because I had colleagues supporting me. And they didn't fire me, thank goodness, or it would have been a very short career in the archives for me. So, I do sometimes wonder today if it's tempting to use technologies or assume that they'll be solving problems for us if we don't fully understand them. For example, many archives, including us, are looking at using tools like machine learning and natural language processing. And there are some real values to these tools, but again, without understanding the technologies and their limitations, but without solving some basic problems first, it's easy to make mistakes with these tools. So for example, we use natural language processing software here to describe some of our archives, but we only do that after we have created a basic description of it and added a catalog record describing the archives with our own human understanding of what's included in those, because the machine can have a garbage in, garbage out sort of approach if we don't understand what it's doing. So instead of just blindly trusting the technology, we want to use tools wisely and then build confidence and trust in what we are doing. And you might be saying to yourself, okay, that sounds good, but can you give me a practical example of what I mean? Let's say, for example, that your archives is working with website and website preservation, as I know one of you mentioned in the chat box. And say you are working with a donor who wants to give their archives of a organization that has gone out of business to be preserved permanently. This is something that we did recently with a journalism website, an investigative news website. And the service that we used, which was called Archive, it did an okay job at first, but it also missed a lot of pages. So unless we had somebody looking and doing quality control work and patiently tracing the errors and fixing the problems, at the end, we would not have had a very complete archives. So while everything is not perfect with this collection, we at least have a basis for understanding, and we're still working with the donor to supplement and make it better, because we built some trust, again, by using the tool wisely and by checking to ensure that it is doing what we think it is. Okay, so the story I just told leads to another point, that it's a big mistake to try to invent a new wheel or a new technology or a completely new approach when working with digital archives. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by invent a new wheel? What I mean essentially is this, that it's often very tempting to think that digital archives need to be described in a different way or using a set of different systems than do physical materials. That is an option. You can describe them directly in some separate collections management system, but you can also describe them in the collection management system you use for your physical materials. And here, this is what I'm illustrating, which is a simple screen capture from our own collection management system showing the archives that we've collected in the Archive It in the Internet Archive web archiving application. So instead of developing new tools or developing a new set of tools, we've come to learn, and I recommend that you adapt the existing tools that you have and add other ones where needed. I will give you another example of that with storage of digital materials. Sometimes people ask me if they should buy all kinds of new equipment or set up a separate processing and storage server and architecture. But in most cases, I think we can use the existing storage architecture that we have, and we just simply have a working space where we put the files we are working with on the left-hand side of the screen, and then a long-term preservation space on the right-hand side. So while figuring this out sounds easy, it isn't always easy. For example, we worked for months trying to figure out a practical workflow for moving things from our preservation, or sorry, from the computer where we were processing the records into our digital repository. But in reality, as long as you separate your storage and preservation storage infrastructure from your processing storage and infrastructure, you've made a step in the right direction. Okay, so this leads me actually to my seventh bad practice, or my seventh mistake, as you will. And that is this one, which is arranging and describing items. So this one actually takes a look back at one of the steps on our digital practices, steps to success, which is describing materials. It's about arrangement and description, not about storage. And it may be controversial, a little bit controversial, to say that we should not think about describing items first, because archivists often like to think about describing items, by which I mean individual files. There can be times that this is a good thing to do. It isn't a bad thing to describe an individual item. And in fact, we sometimes do that here at the University of Illinois Library. Here's an item that we've digitized, which we have an item level description for it. The important point that I like to reiterate is that you don't necessarily want to start by describing these items, because digital materials are very, very, very different in nature. They're very bulky, and there's a wide variety of formats. So this need for item level description would not necessarily accommodate the almost infinite variety of ways that such records can be formed, or the fact that they often don't come with item level materials. So instead, what I recommend, or what I've learned to do, is use two sets of archival standards be our guide. The first of these is describing archives, a content standard, and the second one is the archival information packet, which is a core concept from the OAIS reference model. So let these be your guide, and I will just briefly review for you what describing archives a content standard is. This is a standard that was developed in the United States that tells you how to construct descriptive records. And one of the core points that it recognizes is that you should begin by describing materials at the collection level, then the series level, which is a group of related materials, and only then move to file item level description, because by describing the collection as a whole, you may give users enough information to help them find materials using access points or other methods. The second part of this that's important is that in working with digital archives here, we always form them into what we call an archival information packet. This is a visual representation of an archival information packet, which is drawn again from the OAIS reference model. And you can see it includes both the content of the record itself or the set of records, which may be anything from 1 to several thousand files. But it's also the descriptive information about them all tied together in a packet, if you will. If describing archives a content standard tells you how to develop descriptive metadata, the AIP is the entirety of the things you are trying to describe. So I won't review that in a lot of detail. I will just refer you here to an example of a archival information packet and the associated catalog record in our descriptive system. So you can see on the left-hand side here, we have descriptive metadata, and we have an ID linking this to the materials themselves in our system. What this means in practical terms is that once the entirety of the records are described, you can use clues from the folder and file names and then help users rely as much as possible on embedded metadata in the file to give the researcher meaningful flags by which to orient themselves in a collection. I've provided an example here of a set of records from a professor here on campus, a distinguished professor, and you can see we have grouped the materials as he did on his computer. And with these tools in place, we can have large collections where we use the folder structure to guide people to the types of materials that they want to discover. We don't have to have item level descriptive metadata. Okay, so that leads me to my 8th bad practice, which is having standards drive your decision making. I don't want you to get me wrong. I think that standards like the OAIS model that I mentioned are very important, as are format standards such as PDF-A. In fact, one of my other projects, I'm working to develop a standard for email archiving in PDF. But what I'm saying is that the requirements of those standards should not become an end in and of themselves. Instead, we should always allow user needs to shape the way that we use our standards, or even lead us to develop the new standards. So I'd like to just give you 2 brief examples here. The first concerns a sort of system level decision made at my organization. Like most libraries, we have a digital preservation repository, and you know, a lot of these preservation repositories have very rigid metadata models. But in our case, we've gone out of our way to design a repository service that allows us to have metadata profiles that can be applied across 1 or more collections. So in the case of the collection that I've shown here, we're able to determine which fields are shown to the users, which are searchable, which are sortable, and which are indexed. So not everything needs to be treated the same way. So for example, in this case, we do not make the collection facetable on the title because that would get confusing to users. So instead, we let user needs shape our adoption. We don't let the standard make our decisions for us. Okay, bad practice number 9, looping back here to storage and preservation. Putting all of your eggs in one basket or all of your files in one place is obviously a very bad thing. Instead, we know that lots of copies keep things safe, and you should assess all of your systems. So 3 copies is recommended as a minimum for all digital archives, 2 of those in different locations. The reason why I bring this up, it seems like, again, like a very simple point, but it's one that you can easily find yourself caught in a situation where not everything is being preserved in multiple copies. In fact, I found out at our own repository here about 6 months ago that we had a 10 terabyte storage location of very important data for which there was no backup plan and no physical or no virtual copies being made in backup. So we solved that problem because we kept in mind this idea: do not put all of your eggs in one basket. Okay, and last but not least, this leads me to my final mistake or final bad practice, which is building, yes, 3 backups is recommended, 2 in separate locations from each other. So last but not least, here's my final mistake, which is building access for known uses. We all know about people who use our collections. And we think we know them very well, and we should certainly take those individuals into account. But we also need to realize that future generations, or even people in this generation, will often have creative materials to reuse our digital archives. So instead, what I like to do is treat collections as a form of data that people can access. In practice, this means things like making digital archives downloadable in bulk format, with accompanying information about the rights of those collections. It means things like developing application programming interfaces so that users can access collection information and metadata on their own terms. And it means things like making it easier for users to complete tasks like text mining, data visualization, mapping, image analysis, audio analysis, and network analysis. As a practical example of that, I would just cite here the work of the Hathi Trust Research Center. The Hathi Trust Research Center deals mainly with digital books. And while I don't have time to delve into all of the details, you can see that they provide some services so that people can access these collections essentially as data and use them with their own programs, their own text mining, data analysis, and so on and so forth in the future. So that is it. Those are 10 mistakes and hopefully 10 good practices that you can use alongside of them. I would like to just thank all of you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Abdallah, and I have lots of time here to stay and hopefully engage in discussion, questions, and conversation with all of you. But again, thank you so very much. I'm just very happy to be with you here this evening.
Thank you, Professor Christopher. Thank you so much for this informative presentation and practical guidance, by the way. I believe that everyone could make a mistake. But if these mistakes happened in sensitive paper like documents, record, and archives, it could be, as I said, a disaster. So it is important to listen carefully for the guidance and the instruction suggested by you, Chris, and dealing with them with consciously. I think, them consciously, because I think not only to avoid these such mistakes, but I think it's important also to improve the quality of the archival practices that are carried out in our institution. So thank you so much, and I'll open the questions with inviting Dr. Fahd to give us his reflection or any question he need to raise it or comments. Please, Dr. Fahd.
مرحبا بتلك الأخطاء التي يمكن أن تعلمنا. حقيقة جدا رائعة تلك الأخطاء التي استفدنا منها وتعلمنا منها من خلال حديث البروف كريستوفر بروم. لا شك كما ذكر البروف كريستوفر أن الأرشفة الرقمية مهمة جدا في حفظ يعني كل ما يتعلق بالمنظمات من سجلات وخلافه أو مؤسسات. لكن موضوع الأرشفة الآن أو موضوع الأرشفة الرقمية تغير مفهومها الآن، وخصوصا بعد التطور الهائل في التكنولوجيا.
صحيح.
فربما كانت الوسائل القديمة للأرشفة قد لا تنفع اليوم أو لا تصلح اليوم في ظل هذا التطور الكبير في التكنولوجيا، والتي تساهم في حفظ يعني السجلات المهمة في المنظمات. السؤال لسعادة البروف، هل فعلا تغير مفهوم الأرشفة عما كان في الماضي؟
شكرا سعادة العميد، وأعتقد أن في القناة الأخرى قد تم ترجمة كريس. Did you hear the English questions that just raised by the Dean?
Yes, thank you. If I understood the question correctly, it was for me to reflect a little bit on how current archiving with digital materials is different from working with print materials. Is that part of the question?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, very good. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Fahad, for that question. It's a very good question because what I think fundamentally is that we use some of the same principles we used for paper-based materials, but we apply them slightly differently, and we really need to use quite advanced tools to make them practical with digital materials. So to take an example of this, if I were working with files from a file cabinet, I would try to keep them in the original order, when I process them physically. And when I work with digital tools, I would do the same thing. I would keep them in the original order, but I would also try to use things like metadata extraction tools to pull metadata from those files. So for example, with photographs, you can use tools to access the metadata that's written into the file and then put that in a separate database and make it searchable. So you always need to know that there are advanced tools that we can use, and they are useful, but that doesn't mean that we should rearrange everything from its original order, if that makes sense. But yes, the digital deluge is very, very concerning to us as well. The pace of evolution with digital technology is so fast. For example, I didn't mention the complexities of preserving social media records such as Twitter or other social media platforms. Those are very challenging to deal with, which is probably the topic of another presentation.
Yes, indeed, yes. سعادة العميد لو عندك أي تعليق آخر تفضل.
حقيقة نحن في جامعة حفر الباطن ممثلة في عمادة شؤون المكتبات نشكر سعادة البروف كريستوفر بروم على طرحه الرائع لهذه الندوة القيمة المعنونة بالأرشفة الرقمية، ونشكر حقيقة سعادة رئيس الجامعة الدكتور صالح بن مفلح آل صقر، وسعادة وكيل الجامعة للدراسات العليا والبحث العلمي البروف الدكتور عبد الله الضلعان على دعمهم الدائم لكافة أنشطة عمادة شؤون المكتبات، ولعل من أهمها هو توقيع اتفاقية مع أكاديمية نسيج، الأكاديمية الرائعة التي دائما ما تتحفنا في بعض أعمالها بالظهور يعني أو تزويدنا بعلماء على مستوى عالي من المقدرة العلمية، وأيضا نوعية الدورات المطروحة من قبلهم. حقيقة نشكر لأكاديمية نسيج هذه التعاون وعلى هذا التنظيم الرائع، ونشكركم الدكتور عبد الله سعادة البروف الدكتور عبد الله متولي على يعني تنظيمكم لهذه الندوة، وأشكر الجميع. دمتم في رعاية الله وحفظه.
أشكركم سعادة العميد دكتور فهد الجمعي، ونثمن على شكرك للإدارة العليا في الجامعة ممثلة في المدير والوكلاء والنواب، وهذا إنجاز التعبير بداية لمزيد إن شاء الله من أنماط التعاون. أستسمحكم في أن احنا نطرح التساؤلات الآن مع البروفيسور كريستوفر وكما أشرنا في البداية أن هذه التساؤلات ستطرح باللغة الإنجليزية، وعلى القناة العربية يمكن لأي من الحضور أن يسمع الترجمة أو يطرح أيضا بالعربي، فأستسمحكم سعادة العميد. Please, Christopher, we receive a flow, dozens and hundreds of questions, so I try to do my best to try to merge some of them, classify them, to get as many as we can from this. The first one is related about your 10 bad practices, how it would be in terms of your valuable experience to be classified. They need just which the top one. This is one of the beginning of the question. How you classify them from your point of view, which is the first one that you think, or the first 3 of them is the highly important.
Yeah, good, very good question. I very much appreciate that. I think the most important one is developing partnerships and understanding what, as an individual, you can contribute to digital archives work. What I've learned over the years is that my own set of skills and practices lies mostly around helping other people organize their own talents. That's why I now work as an administrator in my university, because I seek to help other people develop their capacity. That's why I love talking to audiences like you, but I don't understand the technical details of many of these systems. I'm not a programmer, right? So I think the most important thing is understanding your own skills and then seeking people to help complement areas where you are not as strong. So that would be the most important one. I think another very important one is this idea of the 3 copies, and understanding that it's always good to have a backup plan in place. It's actually very easy to destroy digital materials inadvertently if you're only working with 1 copy. You know, with physical materials, if something's destroyed, you know, it could have a physical problem develop. But sometimes we tend to treat the digital materials in a little bit more offhand fashion. So I would recommend that as another one. But really, I tried to build these as a ladder, so they're all a little bit important to me.
Excellent. Thank you, and thank you for this telegraphic answer. We received another question. It's not just here in the webinar, but we received also through the social media. It's about the security issue and the levels of permission to access to the university or education institution digital archive. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, security is a very important topic. We, like most universities, have a chief security officer here on campus, and we coordinate very carefully with him. For example, if we're acquiring an email collection, we get permission from that individual first before accessing it, because there may be student records included or other materials. And we need to be very secure in the way we treat those records to ensure that they're not included in things that are provided to the public. We also have good security permission protocols within the repository software. We like to think in terms of levels of access so that very few individuals have full access to the entire set of materials, but other groups of people may have access to a portion of them, or a portion that can be made publicly accessible. So yes, I probably should have mentioned security. It's extremely important, and it underlies all of the other areas that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here. It's about, okay, at the place where I work, we rely on the auto-preservation. If there was a human error by deleting items accidentally, we know who we know should blame, or who we should blame to do. So how about any crash happens because of the software? I think he is just pointing now about the trusting issue that you mentioned during your presentation, Chris. Please.
Yeah, no, that's important. I mean, we have one of the systems we'd worked with over the years too. We noticed that it wasn't keeping a record of when people made changes within the system, and well, on the one hand, you want to know who to blame for the problem. On the other hand, you need to know to ask to help sort the problem out and fix it. So it's good to have systems like that that keep revisions of things and keep copies of them. That's actually been for us one of the advantages in using cloud services, because a lot of them, such as Google Docs or Dropbox or Box file system, keep a revision history. So if something is accidentally deleted, there's often a way to go back and recover it. We find that's
Yes.
similarly the case with services like email. So.
Perfect. Yes, and we have here Mr. Mustafa. He's just saying that in Arabic, there is many steps should be taken to preserve and face ahead such a mistake, such as losing the data, so we can make a backup. We can just have this solution ahead of having the problem or facing such a problem. There is another question here about, please, he asking you about the clouding, and do you encourage the clouding archives?
So the use of cloud technologies, is
Yes.
that the, yeah.
Yes.
Right, we actually, I do strongly encourage it. Actually, we had here for many years tried to run our preservation repository using local technology. I mean, we're a major research institution and we have a good, strong supporting infrastructure, but it is focused around research. It's not really focused around data preservation. So after a number of years, we learned that it was actually to our advantage to use cloud providers such as Amazon Web Services, or in our case, we also use Microsoft Azure, but there are many options there. So all of our copies of our digital repository are now in those cloud services, and it's more cost effective for us, and it's also more secure because we have 3 copies in 3 different locations, as well as monitoring to make sure if something changes in one location that the system heals itself.
Okay.
So yes, I do recommend using
Yes.
cloud services if you have that as an option.
Okay. Another question, it's about, we need to have more enlightenment from you, Professor Christopher, about the mistakes related to the document control, mainly within the university.
Mistakes about the document control. Yes, I mean, I would say
it needs another presentation, webinar, but let's do it in a quick one.
Yeah, I mean, as a quick one, I think the biggest problem I see in the university here is a lack of good use of email records in particular. A lot of people don't understand how the email system works, or they understand that when they put things in email that they are likely to become public records at some point in time. So they tend to delete them even though they may contain valuable information. So there are, I think another problem we face is we have a lot of records management advice and schedules that we develop for people, but they don't always know how to follow them, or they don't follow them very carefully. So yeah, that is, as you say, a topic for another presentation.
Okay, we have from Mr. Ahmed, he's asking about these 10 mistakes. Do you think that it makes difference if we're talking about the personal documents or the institutional documents? It makes difference if we talk about this personal archive, if you can call it like this, or the institutional archive, you find the mistakes?
Yeah, very good question. I think the 10 mistakes were intended to apply either to personal collections or archives, or to institutional records. I will say that because I was trained in the government and public records tradition, I tend to use that approach in managing collections. I would say we find in a lot of our personal archives, we do use a lot more techniques focused around item level description and a higher level of processing or management of those collections. In those cases, we would, for example, probably try to have some descriptive metadata for each photograph or document, whereas we might not do that with our government or institutional records because they're much more bulky. They're just larger, the government and institutional records.
Perfect, and thank you. We have a comments here. Thank you, Professor Christopher, for this outstanding presentation. My question is about using artificial intelligence in improving the value of digital archive.
Yeah, good question. I think, to be honest, the jury is still out as to how valuable it will be. I did collaborate with my colleague Bethany here several years ago on a program where we tried to apply machine learning and artificial intelligence to a set of records that had been digitized. The problem we ran into there were so many errors in the identification of the characters that it didn't classify the documents as well as it might have. So we would like to try a program instead where we try machine learning or artificial intelligence to classify records that start in digital form, but we have not done that yet. I do know there are some other projects here in the United States, and that the National Archives in particular is looking very seriously at the ability of artificial intelligence to machine classify records. I also know there are a lot of ethical issues regarding this topic, particularly with photographic materials. As most of you likely are very aware, there is facial recognition software, and I would have some questions about how to ethically apply that software with archival materials, particularly if individuals are not already identified in the photographs. But it could be very valuable if it's used, for example, with public figures or other individuals who already are well known in the public mind.
Perfect, thank you. I think it's a personal experience here in my institution and the other institution. Mostly they prefer keeping their archived as a physical form, in a physical form, instead of the digital form, for either security or privacy purpose. How do I convince them to move to the digital archive? I think this is old and renewal question, Chris, right?
Yeah, it's a perennial question.
Yes.
I hear it very frequently, and it's a subject of many long conversations with people, which we have not always been successful ourselves in resolving in the way we would like to. I can tell you a little bit about one instance where it worked for us. We have an office here on our campus called the Chancellor's office. In fact, I now work as part of the Chancellor's office. It's our central administrative group on campus, and it has responsibility for all of academic and program affairs on campus. And they've kept a large central archives or central records unit for many years. In our archives here, they historically transferred about 20 boxes of material to us every year, to the point where we had 500 record center sized large boxes about so big from this group. And finally, we said to them that we cannot continue to take this amount of physical material every year because we knew they were scanning it, right? And they had a scan system, and they were very pleased at that, because if we hadn't taken it in digital form, they would have been required to buy a storage solution to housing physical materials. So I think in that case, it was fortunate for us that they agreed, but I don't really know what argument convinced them, other than the fact that they would have had to pay money that they didn't want to pay. So.
Yeah, I think it needs a little bit of administrative decisions and action, just to give the confidence and also the peace of mind for those who are still not feel comfortable about having in digital form.
Yeah, that's
okay.
very true.
Here the question about the new role for staff in this big jump in the archive, and what skills, competences, and qualification you think this is the most to be suggested for them to cope with this new era of digital archive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say the first and most important thing is that the staff members approach digital technology with a sense of curiosity, as opposed to feeling somewhat threatened by it. I would say if that's the case, most of the concepts of digital archives and the tools are relatively easy to learn. There are some good resources I can point all of you to. For example, the Digital Preservation Coalition in the United Kingdom makes available a wide range of free resources, technical reports and guidance documents that people can read. I would say at first, an important place to start would be understanding just the basics of arranging and describing digital materials. Again, there are courses that can be taken on this topic in, I would think, Naseej Academy. You probably have types of things that people could engage with. Here in the United States, we have groups like the Society of American Archivists, where I've gotten some of my training from. But I would say things like core digital preservation concepts, collection database management, file transformation and migration. These are all important topics to begin training in.
Perfect. I think as the time is running out to us, we will have 3 more questions, and we do apologize for the rest of the question, and we can receive it over the email and share the answer with you. The first one here is about, as you mentioned, 10 mistakes and how to mitigate it. We need about the 10 feature that should be looked at about the digital archive software or system that when we evaluate it or choose it, without naming for sure. So just the criteria.
Yeah, no, good. There's so the question is essentially, what criteria would you use to evaluate a digital archive system? Yes, there is a resource I can point you to called the Digital Power Project. It's, I would need to find the link to this, but there is a tool selection grid that this organization has developed. I'm typing here. So there's this, we can look for this. There's a link I can provide to it. That would be a good place to start. I would say one of the most important criteria, of course, will be whether they are following sort of best practices within the field. I think there are a wide range of options you can look at here, different companies out of both the United States, Europe. I would hope there are also some in the Arabic-speaking part of the world as well. But this selection grid is important. I think one of the critical things to look at is what type of metadata support they offer, how easy the software is to use. You don't want to necessarily spend a lot of time training or learning to use the software. And then thirdly, how do they store their preservation copies of the material? Is it stored in a secure way? Are the files monitored so that any changes are corrected, problems healed, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, Perfect. So there is another question about the AI, and we talk about it. We can just wrapping up with this question about the future of the digital archive as you see it, Chris, and link this also for the open archives initiative that we see. And this will be the last question that we will raise it. Please, Chris.
Yeah, so I do think the future points more in the direction of organizations being part of shared services or collaborations. Again, you know, there are these companies that offer services such as Preservica. There are companies here in the US that offer these shared services. In our own repository here in the University of Illinois, we look at working with 12 or 15 other universities to develop a shared service. So I think that's a good direction to explore. I do think the AI and the artificial intelligence is part of the future as well, but I see more effort being put into preservation of special collections type materials, such as these unique records from institutions and organizations.
Okay, would like to thank you so much, and we do apologize for the question that raised recently, because we promise you to stick to the time, and we exceed already the time, and for sure the Dean, Dr. Fahad, just already have his engagement. So we would like to thank you, Christopher, so much for this presentation. For sure, we will have you again in other one. And let me just confirm, convert to speak in Arabic on this one. أشكر سعادة العميد دكتور فهد الجمعي على تشريفه لهذا الويبينار وتفعيله للاتفاقية مع أكاديمية نسيج ممثلا لجامعة حفر الباطن. وأترك الكلمة الأخيرة لك سعادة العميد مع تأكيدي على أن البرزنتيشن وشهادات الحضور سوف ترسل إلى السادة الحضور. سعادة العميد لك الكلمة الأخيرة نختتم بها هذه الويبينار. تفضل.
شكرا لك سعادة البروف الدكتور عبد الله. حقيقة نشكر سعادة البروف الدكتور كريستوفر بروم على هذه الندوة القيمة التي تتحدث عن الأرشفة الرقمية ومدى أهميتها، وأيضا الأخطاء العشر التي حقيقة هي أنا أعتبرها درس لنا. تعلمنا من أخطاء كريستوفر، وبإذن الله نطور أنفسنا من خلال هذه الأخطاء. فدائما يعني الشخص الذكي هو الذي يستفيد من أخطائه، فنحن نتعلم من دائما نتعلم من الأخطاء. أشكر الجميع وأتمنى أن نراكم في أتم صحة وعافية، وإلى لقاء آخر بإذن الله تعالى.
نشكرك سعادة العميد فهد الجمعي. Thank you, Christopher, again, and we do appreciate that. ونشكر السادة الحضور. And if you just comment about something as a last word, Christopher, you be our guest.
Thank you all so very much. I'm so very happy to have had the opportunity to work with you, Dr. Abdullah, Dr. Fahad, thank you as well. And I really a big heart of thanks to all the attendees here. I'm just so happy to be able to have made your acquaintance, if only for a few minutes here. And I hope that I might hear from many of you in the future. Again, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. شكرا للسادة الحضور. شكرا سعادة العميد، ونترككم جميعا في رعاية الله، وعلى لقاء في ندوة أخرى من ندوات أكاديمية نسيج بالتعاون مع حفر الباطن وكثير من الشركاء معنا من الجامعات. شكرا جزيلا، ونترككم جميعا في أمان الله. سلام عليكم.